The glass door of the Valentine Harbor restaurant exploded inward, and a young woman crashed to her knees on the marble floor right in the middle of the wealthiest room in the city. Silverware stopped midair. 40 people stared. Nobody moved. She lifted her head, lips white, and forced out 4 broken words. "I can't go farther." And every rich man in that room turned back to his steak. Everyone except a quiet single father by the window, a former Navy medic who hadn't touched medicine in 6 years. Because what nobody in that restaurant knew was that the helpless girl on the floor was worth $900 million, and the man about to lift her up was the only person there who didn't care. Before we go on, drop the name of the city you're watching from in the comments so I can see how far this story travels tonight. And if you believe there are still good men left in this world, hit subscribe and stay with me to the very end. Trust me, you'll want to see how this one finishes. Caleb Morgan had promised his daughter one perfect night, and for exactly 11 minutes it had been. He sat at the corner table by the window, the one the hostess had given them almost reluctantly, as if she wasn't sure a man in a pressed but clearly second-hand jacket belonged in a place where the appetizers cost more than his weekly grocery bill. He hadn't argued. He'd just said, "Thank you, ma'am," and pulled out the chair for his 8-year-old daughter like she was visiting royalty, and Emma had giggled and whispered, "Dad, you're being so fancy." And for a moment, that had been enough. "You earned this," Caleb told her, tapping the folded report card he'd slid into his shirt pocket like it was a medal. "All A's. You know how many kids get all A's?" "You already said, 3 times. "Because I'm proud 3 times. Emma rolled her eyes the way only an 8-year-old could with her whole face, and reached for a bread roll. "Can I get the one with the little tower of chocolate, the one on the menu with the gold on top?" Caleb glanced at the price and felt his stomach tighten, but he smiled anyway. "Tonight, you can get 2. Really, really, but don't tell your grandmother or she'll say I'm spoiling you." "You are spoiling me. That's the plan." He watched her tuck into the bread, her legs swinging under the table, because they still didn't reach the floor, and he thought not for the first time that this was the whole point of everything. Every double shift down at the harbor, every cold morning fixing salt-corroded machinery with fingers that never fully thawed. Every night he came home too tired to stand and stood anyway because she needed dinner and a story and a dad who showed up. All of it for moments exactly like this one. He was thinking that when the front door opened and the night broke apart, she didn't walk in so much as fall in. A young woman mid-20s, in a coat too thin for February, one hand clawing at the doorframe for balance. Her skin had the color of old paper. Her eyes were wide and glassy, in the way Caleb had seen 100 times on stretchers and field cots, and something in the back of his skull. A part of him he'd told himself was retired, went very still and very alert. She took 2 steps, and her legs buckled. She caught herself on the edge of an empty table. Her voice barely made it across the room. "I'm sorry. I can't go any farther." And Caleb watched the room do the thing that would stay with him for the rest of his life. It looked away. Not all at once. It happened in ripples. The couple nearest the door leaned back, exchanging a glance, then returned pointedly to their wine. A man in a charcoal suit lifted his menu a few inches higher, building a little paper wall between himself and the problem. A woman dripping in diamonds murmured something to her husband, and her husband laughed low and private, and neither of them looked over again. 40 people, and every single one of them decided in the space of a breath that this was not their problem. Emma stopped chewing. "Dad, I see her, sweetheart. She's really sick. Look at her." "I'm looking." He was already up out of his chair before he fully decided to be. 6 years he'd kept that part of himself boxed and buried. 6 years since he'd told himself he was done, that he'd left the medicine behind with the uniform that his hands were for fixing engines now and nothing else. And all it took was one look at a stranger's face going gray under fluorescent light for the whole thing to come roaring back like it had never left. "Sir?" A voice caught him 3 steps in. The restaurant manager, a lean man with slicked back hair and a name tag that said Marcus, had materialized between Caleb and the woman, palms up in the universal gesture of "please don't." Sir, I've got this. Let me handle it. Then handle it, Caleb said, not slowing. She needs to sit down before she falls down. I'll call someone. Call an ambulance. Now, not security, an ambulance. Marcus hesitated, and in that hesitation, Caleb read everything he needed to know. The man wasn't worried about the woman. He was worried about the room, about the whispers, about what it would do to a 5-star reputation to have a young woman collapsing between the tables during the dinner rush. Let's just relocate her somewhere quieter. Marcus tried. Maybe outside where she can get some air. It's 28 degrees outside. Sir. Caleb stepped around him. He crossed the last of the distance to the woman and dropped to one knee in front of her, and up close, it was worse than he'd thought. Her breathing was shallow and fast, little sips of air that never went deep enough. A fine sweat sheened her forehead despite the cold she must have walked through. And her eyes, when they found his, held something he recognized instantly, not just pain, but shame. The specific shame of a person who has become, in her own mind, a burden. Hey, he said, gentle, the way he'd once talked to 19-year-olds bleeding out in places that no longer had names, he was allowed to say. Hey, I've got you. What's your name? Her lips moved. Lydia. Lydia. Good. I'm Caleb. Can you tell me how you're feeling? Just talk to me. Dizzy, she whispered. Everything's spinning, and it hurts. Here. Her hand drifted toward her lower abdomen and hovered there, afraid to touch. It hurts so much. Okay, that's okay. You're going to be okay, but I need you to keep talking to me, all right? Don't close your eyes. Look at me. Right here. I'm sorry, she said. I didn't want to make a scene. I just wanted... A tear cut a line down the gray of her cheek. I just wanted to sit somewhere. Like a person. For 1 hour. That's all. I'm so sorry. You don't apologize to me, Caleb said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. Not to me. You hear? You haven't done a single thing wrong. From somewhere behind him, a man's voice cut through, dry and irritated. This is unbelievable. Caleb didn't turn. He kept his eyes on Lydia, but he heard it, and so did she. People pay $200 a plate to not deal with this kind of thing. The man went on. He was heavy-set, red-faced, a linen napkin still tucked into his collar. There are children here. There are people trying to enjoy their evening. If she's unwell, that's a matter for a hospital, not a restaurant. Then help me get her to one, Caleb said, still not turning around. That's not my responsibility. Now Caleb turned. Just his head. Just enough. No, he agreed quietly. It's not. It's mine. So how about you sit down, finish your dinner, and let me do the thing you're too comfortable to do? The man's face went a deeper shade of red, but he didn't answer. Some men, Caleb had learned long ago, only ever got loud when they were sure no one would push back. Push back once calmly, and they folded like cheap tents. The woman in the diamonds spoke up next from a safer distance. Everyone has problems, she said to the table at large, as if delivering wisdom. It doesn't give a person the right to disrupt everyone else's evening. There's a way to do these things. Lydia flinched at that, and Caleb saw it, and something hot moved through his chest. Ma'am, he said, and his voice carried now low and even, and impossible to ignore. There's a young woman 4 feet away from you who can barely breathe, and you're worried about your evening. He let that sit. I hope somebody remembers that about you someday, when it's you on the floor. Silence. Emma appeared at his side. She'd left her chair, left her chocolate tower, left her perfect night, and come to stand next to her father with the fearless, uncomplicated seriousness that children have before the world teaches it out of them. She was holding a glass of water in both hands, careful not to spill it. Here, she said, and held it out to Lydia. You should drink something. My dad says water helps when you feel bad. Lydia looked at the little girl, and something in her face cracked open. She took the glass with a trembling hand. Thank you. she breathed. What's your name? Emma asked. Lydia. That's pretty. I'm Emma. Are you going to be okay? And Lydia, who clearly did not know the answer, looked at the child's earnest face and said the kindest lie she could manage. I think so, sweetheart. I think so. Caleb pressed 2 fingers to the inside of Lydia's wrist. Her pulse was going too fast and too thin, a hummingbird trying to escape. He didn't like it. He didn't like the sweat or the color or the way her sentences were getting shorter. Lydia, he said, I have to ask you some things and I need you to be honest. Okay, even if it's embarrassing. There's nothing you can say that'll surprise me. She nodded. Have you been to a hospital recently? A pause. Yes. When? Her eyes slid away from his. 4 days ago. The words landed in his gut like a stone. 4 days ago you were in a hospital. For what? Surgery, she whispered. I had surgery. What kind? She didn't answer. Lydia, what kind of surgery? The kind, she said, and her voice broke. The kind that was supposed to be the last one. They said it was the last one. They promised. And then she was crying silently, the tears just running and running, while she held the water glass Emma had given her like it was the only solid thing left in the world. It was supposed to fix everything. And now it hurts worse than before. And I couldn't stay in that room another minute. I couldn't, everyone looking at me like I'm already. Okay, Caleb said. Okay, I've got you. 4 days. 4 days after major surgery, and she'd walked out of a bed somewhere and come here alone in a coat, too thin for the weather. That wasn't the behavior of a woman looking for attention. Caleb had seen people looking for attention. This was the behavior of a woman who had run out of places to feel human. He shifted gently and got a look at where she kept pressing her hand. He didn't move her clothing, not here, not in front of a room. But he could see enough at the edge of her sleeve at the line of her collar to catch the flush of heat rising off her skin. The faint but unmistakable signs that a part of her body was fighting something it was losing to. Infection. Post-surgical and not minor. His mind ran the latter the way it used to, automatic cold and fast fever tachycardia, low blood pressure, altered mental state, creeping in at the edges. She wasn't fainting. She was sliding. And nobody in this beautiful, expensive room had the first idea because they'd been too busy being inconvenienced to look. He raised his head. Marcus. The manager was still hovering 10 feet off, phone in hand, caught between 2 kinds of fear. Did you call the ambulance? I was about to. Call it right now. Tell them it's a post-operative patient 4 days out showing signs of sepsis. Say that word. Sepsis. They'll know what it means. Tell them to hurry. Marcus stared at him. Are you a doctor? I was a Navy medic, 14 years. Caleb turned back to Lydia. Call the ambulance, Marcus, please. Something in his tone finally cut through and the manager lifted the phone and stepped away, speaking fast and low. Caleb heard the word sepsis leave his mouth, heard the shift in his voice and knew that at least that part was handled. Lydia's eyes were starting to drift closed. No. Stay with me. Caleb caught her chin, tipped her face up. Lydia, look at me. Emma, honey, keep talking to her. Ask her questions. Anything. Emma, God bless her, didn't hesitate. What's your favorite color? Lydia's eyes fluttered open. Blue. Mine's purple. What's your favorite animal? Horses. I've never seen a real horse. Have you? Lots of them. Are they big? So big, Lydia murmured, and the ghost of a smile touched her face even as another tear fell. Bigger than you'd think. Good, Caleb said. Keep her talking, Em. You're doing great. He glanced up at the room again. 40 people. And now a few of them were finally watching, though not one had moved to help. He caught the eye of a young man near the bar, early 20s, expensive haircut, who had his phone up and pointed at Lydia, filming. Actually, filming. Caleb's voice went flat. Put it down. The young man smirked. It's a public place. That woman is sick and scared, and you're recording her like she's entertainment. Put the phone down. Who are you exactly? Her bodyguard. Caleb stood. He wasn't a huge man, but he'd spent a lifetime in situations where the size of a man mattered less than the stillness of him, and he had that stillness now. He looked at the kid and didn't blink. I'm the person standing between you and someone who's already suffering, he said. And I'm asking you one time to be a decent human being. Put it down. The kid held his stare for a second, 2 seconds, and then his eyes dropped and the phone came down, and he muttered something about it not being a big deal and turned back to his drink. The whole room seemed to exhale. Lydia's hand found Caleb's forearm and gripped it weak but desperate. Don't leave me, she whispered. Please. I know you don't know me, but please don't leave me here with them. I'm not going anywhere, Caleb said. You hear me? I've got you until the ambulance comes, and I've got you in the ambulance, and I've got you at the hospital. I'm not going anywhere. Why? The word came out of her small and raw. You don't even know me. Why would you? Because you're a person, Caleb said. And you're hurting and I'm here. That's the whole reason. It doesn't have to be more complicated than that. She looked at him like she didn't quite believe such a thing could exist, and that more than the fever, or the pulse, or the gray in her skin was what broke Caleb's heart. Somewhere along the line, this young woman had stopped believing that a stranger would help her without wanting something back. Talk to me while we wait, he said, keeping his fingers on her pulse, keeping his eyes on hers. Tell me why you're really here, Lydia. Not the restaurant. Why'd you leave that hospital room? For a long moment she just breathed. Then quietly, in the voice of someone confessing, because in there, I'm not a person. I'm a case. I'm a chart. Nurses come in and read the numbers on the machines, and they never once look at me. Doctors talk over my bed like I'm furniture. The patient is stable. The patient is declining. The patient. The patient. Her jaw trembled. I have a name. I had a whole life before all this. And for 2 years I've watched everyone, my family, my doctors, everyone start looking at me like I'm already a problem to be managed. Like I'm a bill somebody's going to have to pay. And you thought if you came somewhere normal. I thought if I could just sit at a table and order dinner like a regular person for 1 hour, I could remember what it felt like to be me. A bitter, watery laugh. Stupid, right? I couldn't even make it through the door. It's not stupid, Caleb said. It's the least stupid thing I've heard all week. Everyone in here looked at me like I was garbage. Everyone in here, Caleb said, is going to think about tonight for a long time, and most of them are going to be ashamed. But that's their problem to carry, not yours. You didn't do anything wrong by needing help. Needing help isn't a weakness. It's just being alive. She was crying again, but differently now. Not the tears of shame, but the tears of someone who has been holding a door shut against a flood for a very long time and has just felt the first crack of relief. My mother used to say something like that, she whispered. Smart woman. She died 3 years ago, right before I got sick. Sometimes I think if she were still here, none of this would... She stopped, winced. Her hand flew back to her side. It's getting worse. It really hurts. It really, really hurts. I know. Hold on. Help's coming. Caleb glanced at Marcus, who mouthed 4 minutes. 4 minutes. He'd kept people alive through longer with less. 4 minutes, Lydia. You can do 4 minutes. You've done a lot harder than 4 minutes. How do you know? Because you're still here, he said simply. After everything you just told me. You're still fighting to sit at a table like a regular person. That's not a woman who gives up in 4 minutes. Her grip on his arm tightened. Behind them, the room had changed. The businessman with the napkin had stopped complaining. The woman in the diamonds had gone quiet. A hush had settled over the tables, not the earlier hush of judgment, but a different one. The uncomfortable hush of people who are beginning to understand that they are on the wrong side of a moment and cannot now change it. And then the second thing happened that would define the whole night. Lydia shifted, trying to ease the pain, and the strap of the small bag looped across her body slipped, and the bag turned, and something slid out of the open top and dropped to the floor between them. A folded document. Cream-colored heavy paper, the kind that comes from lawyers and hospitals and banks. The kind of paper regular people almost never touch. Caleb reached for it out of pure reflex to tuck it back into her bag to keep her things together the way you do for someone who can't manage it themselves. His eyes caught the letterhead. He didn't mean to read it, but the name was printed in bold across the top, and it went through him like a current, and he read it before he could stop himself. Whitmore Medical Foundation, and beneath it on the line marked, Patient, Whitmore, Lydia A. And beneath that, the name that made the paper feel suddenly heavy in his hand. Guarantor/next of kin. Whitmore, Alexander J. Caleb knew that name. Everyone in the country knew that name. Alexander Whitmore, the medical technology billionaire. The man whose foundation had its name on the wings of hospitals in 40 states. The man whose face was on the cover of every business magazine whose fortune ran into the hundreds of millions, some said past $1 billion. The man who was by any measure one of the wealthiest people in America. And this gray-faced, shaking, weeping young woman who'd crawled into a restaurant looking for 1 hour of feeling like a human being who nobody in this room of wealthy strangers had lifted a finger to help. This was his daughter. Caleb folded the paper closed, slowly, and slid it back into her bag without a word. Lydia had seen him see it. He watched the fear jump into her eyes, a new fear, a worse one he understood before she even spoke. "Please," she whispered. "Please don't." "Don't what?" "Change." Her voice shook. "Don't change now. Please. That's what everyone does. The second they find out. They stop seeing me and they start seeing him. Start seeing the money. Please. For 4 more minutes. Can you keep talking to me like I'm nobody? Like I'm just some girl who couldn't make it through a door?" And Caleb Morgan, single father, harbor mechanic, a man who at that moment had exactly $41 in his checking account and a report card in his pocket he was prouder of than any bank statement, looked at the daughter of one of the richest men in America and gave her the only thing she'd asked anyone for all night. "You're not nobody," he said. "But your last name doesn't mean a thing to me if that's what you're asking. Wasn't going to help you any harder if you were rich. Wasn't going to help you any less if you were broke. You were a person who needed help. You still are. That's all I've got room to see." The relief that swept across her face was so total that for a second she almost looked healthy. "I picked the right table," she breathed. "Out of all of them, I fell in the door and I ended up right in front of the one man who—" She couldn't finish. She just held on to his arm. "You didn't pick anything," Caleb said. "You just got lucky. Even sick people get lucky sometimes." That got a real laugh out of her, weak and cracked but real, and it turned into a cough, and the cough turned into a wince, and Caleb tightened his hand around hers. Emma, still standing sentry, tugged Caleb's sleeve. "Dad, she's shaking again." "I know, baby. Is the ambulance coming?" "Almost here." And it was. From outside, faint but growing, came the wail of a siren cutting through the February night, sweeping up the harbor road toward them. Caleb had never in his life been so glad to hear that sound. "There it is," he told Lydia. "You hear that? That's for you. That's the cavalry. Stay with me. I already told you, I'm not going anywhere." The restaurant doors opened again. A very different entrance this time, and 2 paramedics came through fast with a stretcher, and Marcus was pointing them toward the corner, and the room turned to watch. And as the medics knelt, and Caleb began to talk to them fast and clear. 26-year-old female 4 days post-op, presenting tachycardic febrile hypotensive. I've got a working diagnosis of sepsis, source is likely the surgical site. The paramedics exchanged a look, because that was not how bystanders talked. That was how colleagues talked, and one of them said, "You medical," and Caleb said, "Used to be, Navy, just get her stable," and they did not ask another question. They moved her onto the stretcher. Lydia's hand shot out, searching, and found Caleb's and gripped. "You said you'd come," she said. "In the ambulance, you said," and I meant it. Caleb turned to Emma, and for one terrible half-second, The whole architecture of the evening collapsed on him because he had a daughter. And you don't leave your 8-year-old alone in a restaurant to ride off with a stranger. He would not leave Emma. He could not. Whatever else happened, that was the one law that couldn't bend. But Emma was already looking up at him, and she'd already understood the way she always seemed to understand things before he explained them, and she said, "Go with her, Dad. I'll be okay. I'll stay right here." "Emma, you can't leave her alone. You said—" Her small face was fierce. "You said nobody should be alone when they're scared. So go." And Marcus of all people, Marcus, who'd spent the whole night trying to make the problem disappear, stepped forward, and something in the man's face had changed too. "I'll stay with your daughter," he said quietly. "Right here at this table. I'll get her whatever she wants. She won't be alone for 1 second, and the moment you can, you call the restaurant and I'll put her in a cab straight to the hospital or wherever you say. I promise you." He swallowed. It's the very least I can do." Caleb looked at him. Looked at Emma. Looked at Lydia on the stretcher, white-knuckled, watching him, waiting to find out if he was like everyone else, after all, the kind who says I'll be there and isn't. He crouched down to Emma's level. "You listen to me. You do not leave this table. You do not go anywhere with anyone except this man right here, and only if I call and say it's okay. You've got your grandmother's number in your head. 555-0140, Emma recited. "Good girl. If anything feels wrong, you call her, but nothing's going to feel wrong. I'm going to make sure this lady's safe, and then I'm coming right back for you. You are the most important thing in the whole world to me, and I am coming right back. You understand?" "I understand." Emma threw her arms around his neck and squeezed. Then she pulled back and looked past him at Lydia on the stretcher, and she said in the clear, ringing voice of a child who means every word, "Don't be scared. My dad's the bravest person there is. He's going to take care of you. He takes care of everybody." And Lydia Whitmore, heiress to a fortune patient in 100 cold hospital rooms. A young woman who had walked out into the winter night, convinced she was nothing but a burden. The world was tired of carrying, heard those words from an 8-year-old girl, and began quietly to weep. Not from pain this time. From something she hadn't felt in a very long while, and had almost forgotten the shape of. "Let's move," a paramedic said, and they lifted the stretcher. Caleb rose. He gave Emma's hand one last squeeze, gave Marcus one last hard look that said, "I am trusting you with the only thing I have." And then he turned and walked beside that stretcher out through the room, full of the wealthiest people in the city. The people who had watched a dying girl beg for help and decided it wasn't their business, and not one of them said a word. At the door he paused. He didn't plan to. But something made him turn just once and look back at all of them. The businessman with the napkin, the woman in the diamonds, the kid with the phone, all of them frozen at their $200 plates. "She was on your floor for 10 minutes, Caleb said, and his voice wasn't angry, which somehow made it worse. 10 minutes, and not one of you got up. I hope your dinner was worth it." Then he turned and followed the stretcher out into the cold, and the siren swallowed the sound of the door swinging shut behind him. The night air hit him like a slap sharp with salt off the harbor, and the ambulance lights painted the whole street red and white and red again. They loaded Lydia in the back, and Caleb climbed up after her without asking permission, and a paramedic started to object, and then saw his face and didn't. He took the seat beside her and took her hand again, because she was reaching for it, and the doors slammed shut, and the ambulance lurched forward into the dark. "You came," Lydia whispered. Her eyes were half closed now, her voice barely there under the beep of the monitor they'd clipped to her finger. "You actually came. I told you I would. People say that." "I'm not people," Caleb said. "Now hush and let them work. Save your strength." She managed the smallest shake of her head. "There's something you should know," she breathed. "About my father. About why I really left tonight. It's not what you think, it's worse. When you find out what's really going on, you're going to—" "Lydia." Caleb leaned close, his voice low and steady in the rocking dark of the ambulance. "Whatever it is, it can wait. Right now, the only thing you have to do is breathe, in and out. That's the only job you've got. Can you do that one job for me?" Her fingers tightened around his. In and out. she echoed. That's it. In and out. I've got the rest. And as the ambulance screamed through the winter streets toward a hospital that bore, though Caleb didn't yet know it, the very same name, printed on the document in her bag, as the monitors beeped, and the young paramedic worked, and the city lights slid past the frosted windows in long smears of gold. Caleb Morgan held the hand of a stranger he'd known for 11 minutes and made her a promise he had no idea how completely it would change both their lives. I've got you, he said again, quiet just for her. Whatever's coming, I've got you. He didn't know yet who her father really was. He didn't know what the man wanted or feared or had done. He didn't know that this single act of kindness in a restaurant full of people too rich to care was about to reach back into every part of the life he'd so carefully rebuilt, into the medicine he'd sworn off, into the grief he'd buried, into the very reason he'd become a man who fixes broken things because broken things at least can be fixed. He only knew what he had always known, the one thing that had never once steered him wrong. When a person is suffering right in front of you and everyone else looks away, you don't look away. You reach down and you carry them. The ambulance ride lasted 9 minutes, and Caleb counted every one of them by the beeping of the monitor. Pressure's dropping, the young paramedic said, and there was a new tightness in his voice that Caleb recognized the sound a man makes when a situation is getting away from him. 82/40. She's crashing. Then get a line in her other arm and run fluids wide open, Caleb said. You've got her on oxygen, good. What's her temp? 104. Bag of saline, now, and call ahead, tell them what's coming. The paramedic looked at him, this stranger in a second-hand jacket, giving orders like an attending physician, and for a half-second, Caleb saw the objection form. Then it died. Because the man had already watched Caleb work back in that restaurant, had heard the words come out of him clean and correct. And there is a thing that happens between medical people, a recognition that has nothing to do with rank or paperwork. The paramedic reached for the second line. Talk to me, Lydia, Caleb said, bending close to her ear. Stay up here with me. Don't go under. Her eyes were slits. Tired, she breathed. I know you're tired. Tired's allowed. But sleeping's not yet. Squeeze my hand if you can hear me. Her fingers moved against his palm, the faintest pressure. Good. That's good. Do it again in 10 seconds, and I'll be right here to feel it. He kept her going like that, the whole rest of the ride, 10 seconds at a time. A squeeze and a word, and another squeeze, the way you walk a person across a rope bridge in the dark, by making them take one plank at a time, so they never look down at the whole terrible distance at once. And when the ambulance finally braked hard under the red glow of an emergency entrance and the doors flew open, Lydia was still with him, still squeezing, still fighting. This is the part where they take her, and you have to let go, the paramedic told him not unkindly as a team in scrubs swarmed the back of the rig. You did good back there, real good, but this is where the pros take over. I'm coming in. Family only past the doors. Then I'm family, Caleb said and swung down onto the pavement and kept his hand on the stretcher rail as they pulled it out, and something in his tone must have settled it, because nobody stopped him. They ran the stretcher through the automatic doors into a wall of light and noise, and he ran alongside it, and it wasn't until they were halfway down the corridor, until a nurse was calling out numbers, and a doctor was pulling on gloves, that Caleb glanced up at the sign over the doors he'd just come through and felt the floor tilt under him. Whitmore Memorial, Emergency Department, of course. Of course it was. The nearest hospital to the harbor was the one with her own name on the front of it. He'd read that name on the document in her bag not 20 minutes ago, and here it was again, 10 feet high in blue letters. And the strangeness of it landed on him all at once, that he was chasing a stretcher through a building her family's money had built, and not one soul in it had any idea who was strapped to it, and neither until half an hour ago had he. Sir? A nurse had a hand on his chest, gentle but firm, walking him to a stop as the stretcher disappeared through a set of trauma bay doors. This is as far as you go. Let them work. She's septic. Post-op 4 days out source is almost certainly the surgical site. Somebody in there needs to hear that from the start. They heard it. Paramedics called it ahead, and I heard you say it 3 times in the hallway. The nurse's eyes softened. It's handled. I promise you it's handled. Now I need you to sit down before you fall down, because you look about half a shade better than she does. Caleb realized his hands were shaking. He hadn't noticed. Adrenaline did that, held you together like a fist held shut, and the second the crisis passed, the fist opened and everything spilled. He let the nurse steer him to a chair in the hallway, and he sat and he put his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands, and for a moment, he just breathed. Emma. He had to call Emma. He fumbled his phone out and dialed the restaurant, and Marcus picked up on the first ring like he'd been sitting on it. Valentine Harbor. This is. It's Caleb. The man from... I know who it is. She's right here. She's fine. She's got a hot chocolate, and she's beating me at tic-tac-toe, and she is absolutely fine. Marcus's voice dropped. How's the young woman? They're working on her. It's bad, but she made it here alive, so that's something. Caleb pressed the heel of his hand against his eye. Can you put Emma on? There was a shuffle, and then his daughter's voice, bright as a struck bell. Dad, is she okay? Did she make it? Is the lady okay? She's with the doctors now, baby. They're taking real good care of her. Because of you. Because you helped her. Caleb's throat did something complicated. We helped her. You gave her the water. You kept her talking. You did just as much as I did. Marcus said I could have anything on the menu. I had the chocolate tower. It had real gold on it, Dad. Did it now. I ate the gold. Despite everything, the hospital, the fear, the exhaustion sitting on his shoulders like a wet coat, Caleb laughed. A short, cracked, helpless laugh. You ate the gold. It didn't taste like anything. Gold doesn't taste like anything, in case you were wondering. I'll remember that. When are you coming to get me? And there it was, the thing that split him clean down the middle. Because the honest answer was, I don't know. And he couldn't say that to her, and he couldn't leave that hospital yet either, not with Lydia's hand still warm in his memory, and her voice still in his ears saying, don't leave me here with them. He'd made her a promise. He'd made Emma a promise too. And for the first time in a long time, the 2 people he'd promised were pulling him in opposite directions. Here's what we're going to do, Caleb said. I need to make sure this lady's stable, and then I'm coming straight to you fast as the car will go. But it might be a little while. So I'm going to call Grandma, and Grandma's going to come get you from the restaurant and take you home, and I'll be there to tuck you in before you're even asleep. That sound okay? A pause. Is the lady going to be alone if you leave? He shouldn't have been surprised anymore by the size of his daughter's heart, but he was every time. No, sweetheart. I'll make sure she's not alone. Okay. Then that's the plan. A beat. Dad? Yeah. I'm glad we got up. When nobody else did. I'm glad we're the kind of people who get up. Caleb had to hold the phone away from his mouth for a second. When he brought it back, he said roughly, Me too, Em. Me too. Now put Marcus back on. He arranged it all in a few short sentences. His mother-in-law was 10 minutes from the restaurant. She'd be there before the hour was out. Marcus swore on his life he wouldn't let Emma out of his sight until she arrived, and then he hung up and sat alone in the hallway of a hospital he had no business being in, waiting for word on a woman he'd known for barely an hour. The minutes crawled. A doctor came out eventually, mask pulled down around her chin, and she looked left and right down the hall, and Caleb stood before she could ask. Are you the one who brought in the young woman the sepsis? Yes, ma'am. You her family. Caleb hesitated. Then, because a lie in service of a scared person had never yet troubled his conscience, I'm the closest thing she's got here right now. The doctor studied him, and whatever she saw, she decided to take it. She's stabilizing, barely. You bought her a lot of time getting that call made early and getting the fluid started. Another hour, and we'd be having a very different conversation. Where'd you learn medicine? Navy, 14 years, corpsman, then I trained up past it. It shows. She glanced back toward the doors. She's asking for you, actually. Won't settle. Keeps saying a name, Caleb, that you... That's me. We're moving her up to the ICU in a few minutes. You can have 2 minutes with her before we do if it'll calm her down. But 2 minutes, and then she rests. She's not out of the woods. She's just standing at the edge of them. She led him through the trauma bay doors and past the curtained bays to the one at the end and pulled the curtain aside, and there was Lydia, small in the big bed, half a dozen tubes and lines running off her face still gray, but her eyes open and moving, searching, until they landed on him, and something in her whole body eased. "You're still here," she said. Her voice was a ruin, but it was there. "Told you I would be." He came to the side of the bed, and because there was nothing else to do with his hands, he took hers again. "You gave everybody a real scare. You know that doctor says you're the most stubborn patient she's had all week." "Good." The ghost of defiance. "Stubborn's kept me alive this long." "I believe it." She turned her hand over in his gripping. "The document," she whispered. "In my bag. You saw it. You know who my father is now." "I saw a name on a piece of paper," Caleb said. "Doesn't change anything I said in that restaurant. You're the same person you were when I didn't know." "That's just it," Lydia breathed. "That's exactly it. You have no idea how rare, how impossible that is. Everyone changes. The instant they find out. I've watched it happen 100 times. There's this shift behind their eyes, like a door closing and a different door opening. They stop seeing Lydia and they start seeing Whitmore. And then they want something, or they're scared of something, or they're careful around me in this awful way, and I'm alone again, even when the room's full of people." Her eyes filled. "You didn't do it. In the ambulance, you didn't do it. You just kept telling me to breathe. That was the only thing that mattered." "Not to most people." "Then most people are getting it wrong," Caleb said, "and I don't much care what most people do." The doctor stepped in behind him. "Time's up, I'm afraid. We need to move her." Lydia's grip tightened in sudden panic. "Wait, Caleb, my father. Someone's going to call my father. The second they pull up my chart in this hospital, his name is on everything. It's on the building, and someone's going to see it, and someone's going to call him, and when he comes—" She was breathing too fast again, the monitor picking up a nurse glancing over. "When he comes, please don't. Please don't leave the second he walks in. Everyone leaves the second he walks in. They see him and they disappear. Please, just stay 1 minute past when he shows up. So I know. So I know you're not like them." "Lydia, slow down. You're spiking again." "Promise me." "I promise," Caleb said. "I'm not going anywhere just because some rich man walks through a door. I've stared down scarier things than money." A tiny broken laugh escaped her. "You have no idea," she whispered. "You have no idea what you just signed up for." And then they were moving her, wheeling the whole bed out and down the corridor toward the elevators, and Caleb walked alongside as far as they'd let him, which was to the ICU doors. And there a nurse put a hand up and said family could wait in the lounge, and they'd come get him when she was settled. So he went to the lounge, a beige room with hard chairs and a coffee machine and a television bolted to the wall, playing the news with the sound off, and he sat down and he waited. And somewhere in the waiting, his mother-in-law texted a photo of Emma asleep in the back of her car, thumb near her mouth safe, and Caleb looked at it for a long time before he set the phone face down on his knee. He didn't know how long he sat there. Long enough for the coffee he didn't remember getting to go cold in his hand. And he was still sitting there when the doors at the end of the hallway opened, and a different kind of energy came through them. Caleb didn't have to be told who it was. You could feel it before you saw him, the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. A man in a long dark coat, silver-haired, moving fast, and around him a small cluster of people half running to keep up. An assistant with a tablet. A man in a suit who had the flat, watchful look of security, a woman speaking urgently into a phone. The hospital staff straightened as he passed. A doctor materialized from nowhere to walk beside him. The whole floor seemed to tilt toward him like plants toward the sun. Alexander Whitmore. In person, he was smaller than his photographs made him look, but he filled the corridor anyway, and his face, Caleb caught it as he swept past, was not the face of a titan of industry. It was the face of a terrified father. Underneath the money and the coat and the entourage, it was just a man whose child was in danger, and Caleb, who was exactly that himself, recognized it instantly. The doctor was briefing him fast and low as they walked. Caleb caught fragments. Sepsis. Surgical site. Stable now, but critical. Touch and go for the first hour. A bystander who apparently had medical training got the call made early, likely made the difference. Whitmore stopped walking. A bystander. Yes, sir. Ex-Navy, I understand. He rode in with her, wouldn't leave her side. Where is he? The doctor pointed. And a dozen faces turned toward the beige lounge, toward the man in the second-hand jacket, sitting alone with a cold coffee, and Caleb set the cup down and stood up, because that was the thing you did. Alexander Whitmore crossed the space between them in 6 long strides and stopped a foot away, and for a moment the two men just looked at each other, the billionaire and the mechanic. And Whitmore's eyes went over him once, top to bottom, the jacket, the work-roughened hands, the exhaustion, and Caleb braced himself, because he'd heard Lydia's warning, and he knew what usually came next. The flicker, the recalculation, the moment a rich man decided how to handle the situation. But that wasn't what happened. What happened was that Alexander Whitmore's composure, the thing he was clearly famous for, the thing that had carried him through boardrooms and cameras and congressional hearings, simply cracked in half. "You're the one," he said. His voice was not steady. "You're the one who brought my daughter in." "Yes, sir. They tell me she'd be dead. If you hadn't? If you'd waited like everyone else in that restaurant?" His jaw worked. "There were 40 people in that room, they tell me. 40 people, and my daughter collapsed on the floor, and 40 people decided it wasn't their problem." Something terrible moved behind his eyes. "And one man got up, a stranger, who didn't know who she was." "I didn't," Caleb said. "Not till later. It wouldn't have mattered." That, Whitmore said, is exactly why it matters. And then, to Caleb's complete astonishment, the most powerful man he had ever stood next to reached out and gripped his shoulder with a hand that trembled, and his eyes were wet, and he said in a voice stripped of everything but the raw thing underneath, "Thank you. Thank you for seeing her. God, thank you for seeing her." Caleb didn't know what to say to that, so he said the true thing. "She's a fighter, your daughter. I just kept her talking. She did the hard part herself." Whitmore's composure was coming back now, folding itself over the grief like a man buttoning a coat. But it never quite closed all the way again, not for the rest of that night. Is she awake? Can I see her?" "They just took her up. I've been waiting to hear." As if summoned, a nurse appeared at the ICU doors. "Mr. Whitmore. She's settled, and she's asking for—" The nurse's eyes flicked to Caleb, uncertain. "She's asking for both of you. Actually, she's asking for the man first, and she's rather insistent about it, and she's just barely stable, so we'd like to keep her from getting agitated. So if you'd both come, please, but quietly." Caleb saw it, then the thing Lydia had warned him about, the thing he'd promised to stay through. He saw a flicker cross Alexander Whitmore's face. A father told that his critically ill daughter was asking for a stranger before she asked for him. It would have been the most natural thing in the world for that to curdle into something ugly, jealousy, suspicion. The reflexive question of a wealthy man, "What does this person want from my family?" Caleb decided to head it off. "Mr. Whitmore, she's scared." When people are that scared, they hold on to whoever was there in the worst minute, and tonight that happened to be me. It doesn't mean anything except that. She needs her father. Let's get you in there. And Whitmore looked at him. Really looked, and whatever suspicion had begun to form seemed to lose its grip. Because a man who wanted something from you did not talk like that. A man angling for a payday did not spend his one moment of leverage pushing a father toward his own daughter. "You're a strange man," Whitmore said quietly. "I've been told." They went in together. Lydia was propped up now, still pale, still wired to a bank of machines, but her eyes were clearer. And when the two of them came around the curtain, she looked from her father to Caleb and back. And it was Caleb her gaze settled on and held. "You stayed," she said. "Told you I would. He came in and you stayed." Her eyes shone. "Dad, do you see what he didn't run? Everybody runs when you walk in. He just stayed." "Lydia?" Her father started, and his voice broke on the single word, and he crossed to the far side of the bed and took her other hand, the one Caleb wasn't holding, and for a moment the great Alexander Whitmore couldn't speak at all. "Sweetheart, what were you doing out there?" 4 days after surgery alone. "At night the hospital called me and said you discharged yourself against advice this afternoon. I've had people looking for you for 6 hours. I was—" He stopped. Started again. "I was out of my mind. Do you understand? I have been out of my mind. I couldn't stay in that room, Dad. You could have died in a restaurant. I couldn't stay in that room." And there was a force in it, in this woman, who could barely lift her head, that stopped him cold. "You don't understand. You've never understood. In that room, I'm not a person, I'm a project. I'm the thing everyone's managing. The doctors read my chart and never look at my face, and you fly in the specialists, and you fund the wings, and you throw money at it like money's going to fix me, and nobody in 2 years has just sat with me, held my hand, talked to me about horses." Her eyes went to Caleb, filling. "He talked to me about horses, in the ambulance. When I was dying, he asked me about horses so I'd have something to hold on to. And his little girl gave me a glass of water and told me not to be scared." She was crying now, and the monitor was climbing, and the nurse stepped forward, but Lydia pushed on. "That's what I walked out of that room to find, Dad. Not a doctor, not a treatment. Just one person who'd look at me like I'm still here. And I found him on a restaurant floor because none of the people I'm supposed to have would give it to me." The silence after that was total. Alexander Whitmore stood with his daughter's hand in both of his, and Caleb watched the words go into the man like blades, watched each one find something soft and unguarded, and he thought, this is a father who loves his child so much, he forgot how to be near her. He'd seen it before in a different key. Love that turns into logistics. Grief that hides inside doing. A man who would move the earth to save his daughter, and had never once learned how to simply sit beside her while she was afraid. "I didn't know," Whitmore said finally, and his voice was barely there. I thought doing everything was the same as being there. I thought if I got the best people, the best hospitals, if I never stopped fighting for you, I thought that was love. I thought that was how you—" He couldn't finish. "It's part of it, Dad," Lydia said, gentler now, exhausted. "It's a big part, but it's not the part that gets you through the night." The nurse cleared her throat softly. "She really does need to rest now. Her numbers are climbing and we need them flat. I'm sorry. You can both come back in the morning, but right now she has to sleep." Lydia's hand tightened in Caleb's. "You'll come back." He looked at her, this stranger, who was somehow no longer a stranger, and then he looked at her father, because it seemed only right to ask the man's blessing in his own hospital. But Whitmore was already nodding, something almost pleading in it. "Please come back," Whitmore said. "Whatever it please. She's calmer with you here. I can see it. I don't understand it, but I can see it. I can. I'll come back," Caleb said. "But right now, I've got an 8-year-old asleep in her grandmother's car who's expecting me to tuck her in, and I don't break promises to her for anybody. Not even you, sir. No offense." And Alexander Whitmore, worth the better part of $1 billion, accustomed to being the most important person in every room he entered, heard himself ranked below a sleeping child, and instead of taking offense, he almost smiled. The first almost smile of the whole terrible night. "None taken," he said. "Go home to your daughter." A pause. "What's her name?" "Emma." "Emma." Whitmore repeated it like he was filing it somewhere important. "The one who gave Lydia the water. That's the one. Then I owe her a debt too." "You don't owe anybody anything," Caleb said, and he meant it, and he squeezed Lydia's hand one last time. "You get some sleep, That's your only job again, same as the ambulance. In and out. I've got the rest, and now your dad's got the rest too. In and out. Lydia whispered, her eyes already closing. Caleb pulled his hand free gently, the way you set down something breakable, and turned to go. And he'd made it as far as the curtain when Whitmore's voice stopped him. Mr. The billionaire realized with something like embarrassment that he didn't know. I don't even know your name. The man who saved my daughter's life, and I don't know his name. Morgan. Caleb Morgan. Caleb Morgan. Whitmore came around the bed and out into the corridor, with him lowering his voice so as not to wake Lydia. I don't know how to say this without it sounding like the thing she just accused me of. Throwing money at what I don't understand. He ran a hand through his silver hair, and for a second he looked less like a billionaire and more like any tired father in any hospital hallway in the country. But I need to do something. You have to understand, I'm a man who does things. It's the only language I've ever been fluent in. And you just did the one thing all my money couldn't buy tonight. You got up. So whatever you need. A reward. A job, your daughter's college, your mortgage, anything, name it. Mr. Whitmore? Caleb said it kindly, but he said it firmly. I'm going to stop you right there. Because if I take money for this, then it becomes a transaction, and it wasn't one. I got up because your daughter was on the floor. That's the whole thing. The second there's a check attached, it stops being what it was, and I'd rather keep it what it was. Whitmore stared at him. And Caleb watched something shift in the man's face. Something he suspected didn't shift very often, the recalibration of a person who has just met someone he cannot buy, and who is realizing maybe for the first time in years how much he's forgotten that such people exist. You really won't take anything. I'll take a cup of decent coffee because that machine in the lounge should be reported to the authorities. Caleb almost smiled. Beyond that? No, sir. I'll come back tomorrow because Lydia asked me to and because I'd like to know she's all right. And then I'll get back to my life. That's all I've got room for. For a long moment, Alexander Whitmore was quiet. Then he said slowly, like a man thinking out loud about something that surprised him. You said you were Navy. Corpsman. 14 years. Trained up past it toward the end. Trauma critical care. And now I fix machinery down at the harbor. Whitmore's brow drew together. A man with those hands, that training fixing machinery. Machinery, Caleb said, and something old and closed off came into his voice, quiet but unmistakable. A door that had been shut for 6 years, and that he had no intention of opening in a hallway at midnight. Doesn't die on you when you do everything right. I like that about it. Now I really do have to go get my girl. He could see the questions crowding behind Whitmore's eyes, could see the man's mind, that famous, relentless, problem-solving mind, already turning over what it had just learned, already reaching for it, already trying to figure out what it meant, that a trauma-trained Navy medic was repairing salt-eaten engines instead of standing in a place like this one. But Caleb didn't give him the chance to ask. He'd handed over enough of himself for one night. The rest of it, the wife, the grief, the reason he'd walked away from medicine and sworn he'd never walk back. None of that belonged in this corridor to this stranger, no matter whose name was on the building. Tomorrow, Whitmore said instead, releasing it for now. You'll come tomorrow. I'll come tomorrow. Thank you, Caleb Morgan. And he put out his hand, and this time it wasn't a titan extending a favor. It was just one father thanking another, and Caleb took it and shook it. And then he walked back down the long corridor and out through the sliding doors, under the 10-foot letters of a name he'd never expected to know, into the freezing dark of the parking lot, where his mother-in-law's car idled at the curb with the heater running, and his daughter asleep in the back seat. He slid in beside Emma as quietly as he could, but she stirred anyway, the way children do, surfacing halfway. Dad. I'm here, baby. Go back to sleep. Is the lady okay? She's going to be okay. You helped save her life, you know that. You and your glass of water. Emma smiled without opening her eyes, already sinking back down. Told you, she mumbled. We're the kind of people who get up. Yeah, Caleb said softly, and brushed the hair off her forehead and stared out the window at the great lit hospital shrinking behind them as the car pulled away. "Yeah, we sure are." What he didn't say, what he didn't yet fully understand himself, was that getting up in that restaurant had done more than save a stranger's life. It had reached down into a part of himself he'd buried 6 years ago, and put a hand on his shoulder and started very quietly to shake him awake. He could feel it already riding home in the dark, the old instincts stirring the muscle memory of medicine flexing after a long sleep. The strange and unwelcome and undeniable truth that he'd felt more himself in that trauma bay tonight than he had in 6 years of fixing engines. He didn't want it. He'd walked away from it for a good reason, the best and worst reason a man can have. He'd told himself that door was closed and locked and the key thrown into the harbor. But somewhere across the city, in an ICU bed with her father finally sitting beside her, a young woman was sleeping easier than she had in 2 years because a stranger had refused to look away. And somewhere, a little closer in the front seat of a running car, an old man with more money than he could count was staring at nothing, turning over and over in his relentless mind a single snagging fact that the man who'd saved his daughter had the hands of a healer and the job of a mechanic, and had flinched just slightly at the word machinery, and was beginning with all the force of a will that had built an empire to want to know why. He came back the next morning like he'd said he would, and he brought Emma because it was Saturday, and because she'd asked to come with a fierceness that told him she considered Lydia hers, now partly the way children lay claim to the people they help. "Remember," Caleb told her in the elevator, "she's still real sick, so we're quiet and we're gentle, and if a nurse says it's time to go, we go without arguing. Deal." "Deal." Emma held up the paper bag she'd insisted on bringing. "Can I give her the drawing first, or should I wait?" "What did you draw?" "A horse, because she likes horses. I put her on it, and I put you and me next to it so she wouldn't be alone." Caleb had to look at the elevator buttons for a second. "First," he said. "Give it to her first." Lydia was awake when they came in, more color in her face than the night before, though still hooked to half the machines in the room. And Alexander Whitmore was there in the same chair by the bed in the same clothes, and one look told Caleb the man hadn't been home, hadn't slept, had sat in that hard chair the whole night, keeping a vigil he'd apparently forgotten how to keep until a stranger reminded him it was possible. "Look who's back," Lydia said, and her whole face changed when she saw them. But it was Emma. Her eyes went to Emma, she reached a hand toward. "And you brought the water, girl." "I brought you something better than water." Emma marched right up to the bed with the fearlessness that had already carried her through worse, and pulled the drawing out of the bag and held it up. "It's you, on a horse. See, that's you, and the horse is blue because you said blue was your favorite, and that's me and my dad standing here, so you're not by yourself." Lydia took the drawing in both hands, and she looked at it for a long time, longer than a child's drawing strictly required, and when she looked up, her eyes were bright. "This is the best present anybody's given me in 2 years, she said. "I'm not exaggerating. 2 years. "You can keep it forever," Emma said magnanimously. "I have more paper at home." Across the bed, Alexander Whitmore was watching the whole thing with an expression Caleb couldn't quite read, something between wonder and grief. When Caleb caught his eye, the older man rose and gestured toward the door. "Mr. Morgan, a word in the hall." "Go on." Lydia told them, already turning back to Emma. "Emma and I have serious business. She's going to tell me everything about 2nd grade, and I'm going to tell her about the time I fell off a horse, and neither of you gets to hear it." Out in the corridor, Whitmore walked a few paces from the door before he spoke, and his voice was low. "She slept last night. Really slept. First time in, I honestly can't tell you how long. The doctors keep saying her body needs rest more than anything to fight the infection, and she's been too anxious, too wound up to get it. And last night she just..." He shook his head. "I sat there and watched my daughter sleep like a person who feels safe. And I kept thinking I didn't do that. 12 specialists and a hospital with my name on it didn't do that. A mechanic and his 8-year-old did that." "She did it," Caleb said. "She just needed permission to stop being scared for 5 minutes. You keep doing that, handing the credit back. Because that's where it goes. Whitmore was quiet a moment. Then, I want to ask you something, and I want you to hear me out before you say no, because I already know your first instinct is to say no. He stopped walking and faced him. The infection she has, it's serious, but it's the smaller problem. The bigger problem is the 2 years that led up to it. 4 surgeries, Caleb. 4. Each one supposed to be the last, each one failing in a new way. She's been through more than most people go through in a lifetime, and the physical damage is real, but what's really killing her, and I mean that word killing, is that she's given up. She's decided she's a burden. She's decided the kindest thing she could do is stop needing anyone. That's why she walked out of here yesterday. Not to find a restaurant, to disappear a little, to practice not being anyone's problem. His voice roughened. And I've watched it happen for 2 years, and I haven't known how to stop it, because every time I try to help, I make it worse, because my help looks like managing her, and she's right. It does. I don't know how to do it any other way. Mr. Whitmore, let me finish, please. The man drew a breath. I have a foundation, you know that. We fund research, we build facilities. And for 3 years, I've been trying to get a rehabilitation program off the ground, a real one. Not the kind that just does the physical therapy and sends people home. A program for people like Lydia. People whose bodies are healing, but whose spirit is the thing that's actually broken. People who've been reduced to their charts. I've hired directors, I've hired consultants. I've thrown a fortune at it, and it keeps coming out wrong. Clinical. Cold. Exactly the thing it's supposed to fix. Because I keep hiring people who know medicine, and what the program needs is somebody who knows. He gestured helplessly at the space where the right word should have been. People, Caleb said quietly. People. Yes. Somebody who does the thing you did in that restaurant except every day on purpose as the whole point. Whitmore looked at him. I watched you last night. I heard how you talked to those paramedics. That wasn't a man who used to do medicine. That was a man who is medicine and stopped for some reason, and I don't know the reason, and I'm not going to ask you for it in a hallway. But I'm asking you to come run my program. I'm asking you to build the thing I've failed to build for 3 years. Because I think you might be the only person I've ever met who could. And there it was. The offer. Bigger than money, which Caleb could have turned down without a second thought. This was the harder thing. This was the thing that reached in and closed its hand around the exact place he'd spent 6 years keeping walled off. No, Caleb said. Whitmore didn't flinch. I said I knew that would be your first. It's not just my first answer. It's my answer. And Caleb heard his own voice tighten, felt the old grief rise up behind it, like water behind a dam. You don't know what you're asking. You think you're asking me to run a program. You're asking me to walk back into a room full of people I might not be able to save. And I can't do that. I did that for 14 years, and then I did it for the person I loved most in the world. And I lost. And I swore I was done losing people. And the only way to be done losing people is to stop trying to save them. So I fix engines. Engines stay fixed. You do the work, right? They run. Nobody dies because I missed something. Nobody's wife. He stopped. Hard. His jaw locked. The word hung there in the corridor between them. Whitmore's face changed, the businessman's calculation gone entirely, now replaced by something older and simpler. The recognition of one grief by another. Your wife, he said quietly. I'm not doing this in a hallway. No, of course. I'm sorry. Caleb pressed the heel of his hand against his eyes once and got himself back. It's not your fault. You couldn't have known. But that's why the answer's no, Mr. Whitmore. It's not that I don't believe in what you're describing. I believe in it more than you do, probably. It's that I already tried being the man who heals people, and it cost me the one person I couldn't afford to lose, and I don't have another one of those in me. So I'll come visit your daughter, and I'll be glad she's getting better. And then I'll go back to my harbor, and my kid, and my engines, and that's going to have to be enough. Whitmore was silent for a long moment. And then, instead of pushing, instead of doing the thing every wealthy man Caleb had ever met did, which was to treat no as an opening bid, he simply nodded. "All right," he said. "All right, I won't ask again today." A pause. "But I'd like to tell you something and then I'll drop it. May I?" "Go ahead." "When I was building all of this," he gestured vaguely, meaning the hospital, the empire, the whole edifice of his life, "I told myself I was doing it to save people, strangers, millions of them, and I did save some. The foundation's real, the research is real, people are alive who wouldn't be. But somewhere along the way, I used all that saving of strangers as a reason to never learn how to save the one person right in front of me. I built a machine that heals thousands, and I couldn't sit at the bedside of my own daughter without turning it into a project." He looked at Caleb. "You think fixing engines protects you from losing people. And maybe it does. But I'm standing here as a man who spent 30 years fixing everything except the thing that mattered. And I promise you, Caleb, the wall you build to keep from losing people keeps them out, just as well as it keeps the pain out. I know. I'm still trying to climb over mine, and my daughter's 26, and I may have left it too late." His voice caught. "So, that's all. That's the thing I wanted to say. You don't have to answer it." And he turned and walked back toward Lydia's room, leaving Caleb alone in the corridor with the word wife still burning in his chest, and a truth he didn't want, lodged like a splinter beside it. He didn't take the job. But he went back into the room, and he watched his daughter make a critically ill heiress laugh until a nurse had to come tell them to keep it down, and something in him, some long frozen thing, cracked another quiet inch. He came back the next day too. And the day after that. He told himself it was for Emma, who'd formed an attachment to Lydia that no reasonable father would sever, and it was partly for Emma, but it wasn't only for Emma, and by the fourth day, Caleb had stopped pretending otherwise. He came because Lydia had started to matter to him. Because watching her come back to life a little more each day, arguing with the physical therapist, demanding real food, laughing, was the first thing in 6 years that had made him feel like he was witnessing something be repaired. And it turned out that was a hunger he'd been starving without knowing it. It was on that fourth day that the thing happened which changed everything. He'd stepped out to get Emma a juice from the machine down the hall, and he was on his way back when the fire alarm went off. Not a drill. He knew the difference in his bones before his mind caught up the particular quality of sudden real chaos, the way the sound of an alarm is different when it's underscored by shouting. He came around the corner into a corridor that had turned in the space of 90 seconds into something out of a nightmare. Smoke thin, but thickening, curling along the ceiling from somewhere in the direction of an electrical closet. Staff moving fast. And people, patients, visitors, beginning to do the thing that kills more people in fires than fire does, which is to panic. "Dad?" Emma was at Lydia's door, wide-eyed. "Dad, what's happening?" "Stay with Lydia. Both of you stay put unless somebody in a uniform tells you to move. You hear me? I'll be right back." And then his feet were already moving, and his mind was already doing the cold, fast triage. It hadn't done in 6 years, and he wasn't a mechanic anymore. He wasn't a father, sneaking away from a job that scared him. He was a Navy corpsman in a corridor full of people who needed someone who didn't panic. He grabbed the first staff member he saw, a young nurse frozen at a station. "Hey, look at me. What's the evacuation order?" They said this wing, they said move everyone toward the east stairs, but half these patients can't." "Okay, you're with me now. What's your name?" "Danielle." "Danielle, you're doing fine. You just froze for a second. That's over now. Here's what we do. We start with the ones who can't move themselves, and we work toward the ones who can. You take that side of the hall. I take this one. We clear room by room. Nobody skips a room. Anybody on oxygen, anybody on a monitor. We bring the portable stuff, or we call for a wheelchair. We don't leave them. Go." And she went, because his voice had that thing in it. The thing that had settled a whole restaurant with 4 words, and he went too, and for the next 20 minutes, Caleb Morgan disappeared entirely into the work he'd sworn he was done with. He got an old man with an oxygen tank into a wheelchair, and rolled him to the stairs, and handed him off to a firefighter, and went back. He calmed a woman having a panic attack that looked for 30 terrifying seconds exactly like a heart attack, and figured out it wasn't, and got her moving. He found a diabetic patient nobody had accounted for and got her out. He was everywhere, and he was calm, and the calm spread from him outward the way it does from the one person in a crisis who refuses to be afraid, until half the staff on that wing were unconsciously taking their cues from a man in a flannel shirt whose ID badge, if he'd had one, would have said Harbor Maintenance. And Lydia, who was supposed to stay put, who Caleb had specifically told to stay put, did not stay put. Because when a firefighter came to evacuate her, and she understood that Caleb was still somewhere back in the smoke, she made them wheel her toward him, IV pole and all, and she found him coming out of a room with a barely conscious patient in his arms, and she said, "Tell me what to do. Don't tell me to leave. Tell me how to help." And Caleb, who did not have time to argue, looked at this woman who 4 days ago had been dying on a restaurant floor, and saw that the thing keeping her upright right now wasn't the IV or the antibiotics. It was purpose. It was being needed. It was the exact opposite of the burden she'd decided she was. "Take this," he said, and handed her the clipboard he'd grabbed from a nurse's station, the room census. "Your accountability. Every patient that comes past you, you check them off. Anybody's room number I call out, you tell me if they're already clear. You're the reason nobody gets left behind. Can you do that?" "Yes." Her eyes were blazing. "Yes, give it to me." And she did it. From a wheelchair with a fever and a hospital gown and a line in her arm, Lydia Whitmore ran accountability for the evacuation of an entire hospital wing. And she was good at it, sharp and fast, catching 2 patients who'd have been missed. And by the time the fire crew had the electrical fire contained, small in the end, more smoke than flame, but it could have been so much worse, every single patient on that wing was accounted for, and a good number of them owed that to a mechanic and an heiress, who were supposed to be sitting quietly in a room. It was only afterward, in the reassembled chaos of the aftermath, that Caleb realized how many people had watched him. The hospital's chief medical officer found him first, a compact woman with reading glasses pushed up into her hair and a look on her face like she was recalculating something. "You're the harbor man," she said. "The one who's been visiting the Whitmore girl. I've heard about you. I did not know that when there was smoke in my hospital, you were going to run a textbook mass casualty evac out of my East Wing." She folded her arms. "Where did you train?" "Navy, ma'am. Long time ago." "That was not long ago. That was 10 minutes ago, and it was the calmest thing I've seen in this building in years." She studied him. "You know, Alexander Whitmore's been trying to hire a director for a rehab program for 3 years and can't find the right person." "I've heard that, yes. You just showed me exactly the person he's describing." She said it flatly, a statement of fact, and then she walked off to deal with the 10 other things demanding her attention, leaving Caleb standing there with the truth landing on him from a new direction entirely. Because here was the thing he could no longer pretend. He'd told Whitmore that he couldn't go back to medicine because he couldn't bear to lose people. And that was true. But for 20 minutes in that smoke-filled corridor, he had not been thinking about losing anyone. He had been thinking about saving them one at a time, and he'd been more alive doing it than he'd been in 6 years. Of engines that never died on him precisely because engines never died on him. And it turned out, a life where nothing can die is also a life where nothing is really at stake, and he'd been calling that safety when it was actually just a slower kind of dying. He found Lydia back in her room, wrung out, being scolded gently by a nurse for the strain she'd put on her body, glowing anyway. That, she said the moment she saw him, was the most alive I have felt in 2 years. And I know that's a terrible thing to say about a fire. It's not terrible, but it's true. I was useful. People were counting on me, and I didn't let them down, and nobody not once in 20 minutes looked at me like I was a burden. They just needed me to do a job, and I did it." Her eyes filled. "Is that what it feels like? For you? Is that what you gave up?" And Caleb, who'd been running from that exact question for 6 years, sat down heavily in the chair by her bed and for the first time didn't run. "Yeah," he said quietly. "That's what I gave up." "Why?" And so he told her. Not everything, not yet, not the whole of it, but more than he'd told anyone since it happened. He told her about being a corpsman, about being good at it, about the training that took him past corpsman into the kind of work where he held people's lives in his hands, and mostly kept them. He told her he'd met a woman named Sarah when he got out and married her, and that Emma came, and that for a few years everything was as good as a life can be. And then he told her that Sarah got sick, and that he'd been so sure, so arrogantly sure with all his training, with everything he knew that he could manage, it could fight it, could out-medicine it. And that he'd been wrong, that he'd sat by her bed, doing everything right, and watched everything he knew how to do fail one thing at a time until there was nothing left to do but hold her hand, which was the one thing he'd been too busy fighting the disease to do enough of while there was still time. And afterward, he said, "I couldn't the idea of standing over one more person doing everything right and losing anyway, I couldn't. So I quit. All of it. I took a job where the only thing I have to fix is machines, because a machine has never once looked up at me while I was failing to save it. And that's the truth, Lydia. That's the whole ugly truth of why I fix engines." Lydia was quiet for a long moment. Then she said softly, "You held my hand in the ambulance." "I did. You didn't out-medicine anything. You told me to breathe and you talked to me about horses and you held my hand." Her eyes were steady on his. "The thing you said you were too busy to do enough of with your wife. You did it for me. A stranger. On a restaurant floor. You did the exact thing." She let that sit. "You didn't lose the healer when you lost Sarah Caleb. You just decided the healer was the part that failed. But it wasn't the part that failed. The medicine failed. The staying never failed. You're still doing the staying. You did it 4 days ago. You've done it every day since. You just won't call it what it is." And Caleb Morgan, Navy veteran single father, a man who had built a wall 6 years high and told himself it was a life sat in a hard hospital chair and felt something he'd been holding for 6 years, finally quietly begin to give way. Not all at once, not with any drama, but the way ice gives way in spring. A long groan and then a crack, and underneath it the sound of water that had been frozen so long you'd forgotten it could ever move again. He didn't say yes to the job, not that day. But that night, driving home with Emma asleep in the back, he didn't turn the radio on. He just drove in the quiet and thought about smoke-filled corridors and a woman running accountability from a wheelchair and a wall that kept the pain out by keeping the living out too. And somewhere on the dark road between the hospital and home, Caleb Morgan stopped being sure that the answer was no. The uncertainty lasted 3 more days, and then a phone call decided it, though not in the way anybody would have expected. It came at 4 in the morning, and Caleb answered it the way any parent answers a 4 a.m. call, already sitting up, already braced. But it wasn't about Emma. It was the hospital. It was a night nurse whose voice was low and careful, and she said, "Mr. Morgan, I'm sorry to call so early, and I want to say up front, this isn't an emergency. She's stable, but Lydia's asking for you, and she won't settle. And normally we wouldn't call a visitor at 4 in the morning. But Mr. Whitmore said he was very clear. He said if she ever asked for you at any hour, we were to call, so I'm coming." "Sir, you don't have to. It's the middle of the... I'm already putting my shoes on. 20 minutes. He woke his mother-in-law with an apologetic knock, kissed his sleeping daughter's forehead, and drove through empty pre-dawn streets faster than he should have. He found Lydia's room dim, one lamp on, and Lydia sitting up in bed with her arms wrapped around her knees, and the second she saw him in the doorway, her face crumpled with relief and something worse underneath it. "You came," she said. "At 4 in the morning you actually... What happened? Talk to me. Are you in pain?" "No, not that kind." She scrubbed at her face. "I had a dream. That's all it was, a stupid dream, and I woke up and I couldn't. I've been lying here for 2 hours, and I couldn't make it stop." Her voice shook. "I dreamed it worked. The recovery. I dreamed I got better, and I walked out of here, and I had a whole life, a job, a place, people. And then I woke up in this bed with these tubes in my arm, and I remembered that 4 surgeries have failed, and this infection almost killed me. And even if I beat it, there's no promise the next thing won't." She stopped breathing hard. "And I realized I've been letting myself hope again. These last few days. Because of you, because of Emma, because of the fire. I've been hoping. And hope is the thing that's going to destroy me, Caleb. Because I've hoped 4 times, now 4 times, they told me this was the surgery that fixed it, and 4 times I let myself believe it, and 4 times I woke up worse than before. I can't do it a 5th time. I can't survive hoping and being wrong a 5th time. It's safer not to hope. It's safer to just accept that this is what my life is now and stop reaching for more, because every time I reach, they cut it off." Caleb crossed to the bed and sat down in the chair and didn't say anything for a moment, because he knew this speech. He knew it from the inside. It was almost word for word the speech he'd been telling himself for 6 years. "You know what's funny," he said finally. "I've said that exact thing. Not about surgery, about people. It's safer not to hope. It's safer not to reach for more because every time I reach it gets cut off. I built a whole life on that sentence. 6 years. He leaned forward. "And you know what it got me? It got me safe. You're right, it's safer. It absolutely works. Nothing hurt me for 6 years because I stopped letting anything close enough to hurt me." He looked at her. "And I was miserable, Lydia. I was so numb I called it peace. I fixed engines and raised my girl, and I told myself that was a full life. And then a woman fell through a restaurant door, and I got up to help her, and I felt more in 10 minutes than I'd felt in 6 years, and it about knocked me flat. Because it turns out the wall that keeps out the pain keeps out the being alive too. There's no door in it that only lets one through. You brick up the hurt, you brick up everything. So what do I do?" It came out of her small and desperate. "Just hope and get destroyed again." "No." Caleb shook his head slowly. "You hope differently. Here's the thing I've been figuring out, and I'm no expert. I'm 6 years behind you on learning it. The old way you hoped 4 times, you hoped for a fix. You hoped the surgery would erase the whole thing and hand you back the life you had before, like none of it happened. And that kind of hope, yeah, that kind will kill you because that kind's all or nothing. Either it erases everything, or you failed. Either you get the whole old life back, or there's no point." He paused. "But that's not the only kind of hope there is. There's another kind. It's smaller, and it's tougher, and it doesn't break as easy. It's not, 'I hope this fixes everything.' It's, 'I hope today has one good thing in it.' It's, 'I hope I'm useful to somebody this week.' It's, 'I hope I get to see that kid's next drawing.' You don't bet the whole life on one surgery. You bet on Tuesday. And if Tuesday's good, you won. And if the next surgery fails, you didn't lose everything because you already banked all those good Tuesdays and nobody can take them back." Lydia was crying quietly now, but listening. "During that fire," Caleb went on, "you weren't hoping the fire would fix your life. You were just useful for 20 minutes. And it was the most alive you'd felt in 2 years. That's the hope that doesn't kill you, Lydia. Not the big one. The small ones. The ones you can actually collect." "That sounds like a smaller life?" she whispered. "It's not smaller, it's closer. The big hope's always somewhere out ahead of you over the horizon, and you're always straining toward it, and it's always just out of reach. The small ones are right here. They're in the room with you. You don't have to strain for them at all. You just have to stop staring at the horizon long enough to see them." He almost smiled. "My 8-year-old figured this out before I did. She doesn't hope her whole life turns out perfect. She hopes she gets the chocolate thing with the gold on it. And when she gets it, she's completely entirely happy because she wasn't betting everything on something impossible. She was betting on dessert, and she won. That got a wet laugh out of her. She ate the gold, she told me. She was very proud. She was extremely proud." They sat with it a while, the machines beeping softly, the room dim and quiet in that particular hush that only exists in hospitals before dawn. And then Lydia said in a different voice, steadier, You drove here at 4 in the morning. I did. Why? Because you needed somebody and I was the somebody you asked for. You have work. You have Emma. You have a whole life, and a night nurse called you at 4 a.m. and you got in your car. She wiped her eyes. That's not a mechanic, Caleb. That's not a man who fixes engines. Engines don't call you at 4 in the morning because they had a bad dream. You keep telling everyone you gave up being a healer, but you just drove across a sleeping city to sit with somebody who was scared in the dark. That is the whole job. That's all it ever was. And Caleb Morgan sat in the 4 a.m. quiet and finally stopped arguing. Yeah, he said. I know. So say yes to my father. Build the program. Do the thing you did in the fire, except on purpose every day for people who need it as much as I did. She held his eyes. Not because you owe him. Not because of the money. Because you're the man who drives across the city at 4 in the morning, and it's a crime that you've been spending that on engines. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached over and took her hand, the way he had in the ambulance, the way he had every day since, and he said, "Get some sleep. You've got a physical therapist to torment in the morning, and you need your strength for that." And Lydia laughed and lay back and slept, really slept. And Caleb sat in the chair and watched her breathe until the window went gray with dawn. And somewhere in that long, quiet vigil, he made his decision, though he didn't say it out loud until later. He said it to Alexander Whitmore 3 hours later in the hospital cafeteria over coffee that was somehow worse than the machines. "I'll do it," Caleb said. "The program, I'll build it." Whitmore went very still. He set his cup down carefully, like he was afraid a sudden movement would make the words untrue. "You said no. 3 times you said no. I know what I said." "What changed?" And Caleb told him about the 4 a.m. call, about the dream, about the 2 kinds of hope, about a wall that keeps out the living. And Alexander Whitmore listened to all of it with his hands wrapped around a paper cup. And when Caleb finished, the older man was quiet for a long moment. "I have to tell you something," Whitmore said, "and I need you to hear all of it before you react because it might change your answer, and I'd rather lose you now than lie to you into it." He drew a breath. "The program isn't just a program. There's a piece of it I haven't told you. I've been for the last year, I've been quietly building it around Lydia. The whole thing. The first center is designed for cases like hers. Complex chronic patients who've been failed by the system over and over, patients the medicine can't fully fix where the work is as much about the spirit as the body. I built it for her because I couldn't save her myself. And I thought if I could just build the right machine, the right facility staff, with the right people." His jaw tightened. "I did it again, is what I did. The thing she accused me of. I tried to save my daughter by building an institution instead of sitting at her bed. And I've known for months it was the same mistake in a bigger box, and I didn't know how to stop because building things is the only way I know to love people. So..." He looked up and his eyes were raw. "That's what you'd be walking into. Not a clean job, a father's guilt with a budget, and a first patient who happens to be my daughter. If that's too much, if that's more tangled than you signed up for, I'll understand." Caleb turned it over. "Can I be honest with you, please? I don't think you built the wrong thing. I think you built the right thing for the wrong reason, and the reason doesn't matter as much as you think it does. So you built it out of guilt. Fine. Guilt's just love that got frightened. You built a place that's going to help people who've been failed by everyone else. Who cares that you started building it because you couldn't sleep at night? The people it helps aren't going to care why it exists. They're just going to be glad it does." He turned his cup slowly on the table. "And as for Lydia being the first patient, good. She should be. Because she's the one who taught me the thing the whole program's going to run on, which is that the hope that heals you isn't the big one, it's the small ones. She figured that out from a wheelchair during a fire. Put her name on the door, she earned it." Whitmore's composure broke just slightly, just at the corners. "You'd really do this?" "On some conditions." "Name them. Anything." "First Emma comes first. Always." If she's sick, if she's got a school thing, if she needs me, I'm gone, and the program runs without me for a day, and nobody gives me grief about it. That's not negotiable. Done. Easily. Second, I run it my way. You built it out of guilt, and I get why, but the second I take it over, the guilt's off the table. It's not your penance anymore. It's a working program that helps people, and it's run on what works, not on what makes you feel less guilty. If those two things ever conflict, we do what works, even when it's hard for you to watch. Whitmore hesitated only a moment. Done. Third. Caleb's voice dropped. The staying comes first. Before the medicine, before the therapy, before all the fancy equipment your money can buy. Every single person who comes through that door gets a human being who sits with them and sees them before they get anything else. That's the whole thesis. That's the thing nobody else does. If we get everything else right and get that wrong, we've built another cold building with your name on it, and I won't run that. But if we get that right, we can get 100 other things wrong and still be the best thing that ever happened to the people who walk in. Are we agreed? And Alexander Whitmore, who had spent 30 years and hundreds of millions of dollars learning every language of medicine except the only one that had ever mattered to his own daughter, looked across a cafeteria table at a harbor mechanic and said in a voice thick with everything he'd been too proud and too frightened to say for 2 years, "We're agreed. God help me, Caleb, we're more than agreed." The weeks that followed were unlike anything in Caleb's life since the Navy. He gave notice at the harbor, and his foreman shook his hand and said, "Figured you were meant for more than Diesel Morgan," in a way that made Caleb's throat tight. He walked into the half-finished rehabilitation center, a beautiful, sterile, expensive shell of a place, exactly the cold thing Whitmore had feared it would become, and he started tearing out the parts that were wrong. Not the equipment, the philosophy. He fired 2 consultants who talked about patients as cases and throughput. And Whitmore, watching, said nothing because he'd agreed to what works. And it was clear within a week what worked was the harbor mechanic and not the men with the degrees. Caleb hired differently. He hired for the thing you couldn't teach. He interviewed a physical therapist, and instead of asking about her credentials, he asked what she did when a patient cried, and she teared up, describing it, and he hired her on the spot. He passed over a decorated rehabilitation specialist because when Caleb described Lydia's case, the man's first question was about billing codes. "Medicine you can teach," Caleb told Whitmore. "The other thing, you either have it or you don't, and if you don't belong in this building." And Whitmore, who had spent 3 years hiring for exactly the credentials Caleb was now ignoring, began slowly to understand why his program had failed for 3 years. And through all of it, Lydia got better. Not in a straight line, nobody does. There were setbacks. There was a week the infection flared again, and Caleb spent 2 nights in the chair by her bed, and Emma made her 4 new drawings. There was a day she screamed at a physical therapist and threw a cup and then wept, and Caleb sat on the floor of her room with his back against the bed and didn't try to fix it, just stayed until she slid down off the bed and sat on the floor next to him and put her head on his shoulder, and they didn't say anything for an hour. But the line over weeks went up. She stood. She walked first with a walker and then without. She started at Caleb's insistence, and against every instinct her family had to help, to sit with newer patients. The frightened ones, the ones who'd just arrived certain they were burdens, and to tell them from a chair beside their bed in a voice they'd believe because she'd lived it that they were still here, and that here was enough to build on. She became, without anyone quite planning it, the heart of the place. The first patient turned first peer counselor turned, eventually the person the whole program was quietly organized around. Not because of her father's name, though it was on the building, but because Lydia Whitmore had walked through the exact valley every person there was walking through and had come out the other side and could reach back. "You know what you built, don't you?" Whitmore said to Caleb one evening, months in the two of them standing at the window of the now full, now warm, now humming center, watching Lydia laugh with a new arrival in the common room below. "You built the thing I couldn't build in 3 years, in about 11 weeks. "We built it," Caleb said, "and Lydia built more of it than either of us. She's a different person. She's the same person. She just remembered she was still in there. Caleb watched the young woman below, animated, alive, needed. That's all any of them need. Somebody to remind them they're still in there, and then a reason to come back out. Whitmore was quiet a moment. Then, my daughter's alive because you got up in a restaurant, and now 100 other people are going to get their lives back because of the same thing. He shook his head slowly. 40 people in that room, Caleb. 40 people watched her fall. And the whole world turned on the one who got up. Any of them could have been the one, Caleb said. That's the part I can't shake. It wasn't anything special about me. I just got up. Anybody could have gotten up. He looked at Whitmore. That's what scares me and gives me hope at the same time. It's such a small thing, getting up. Anybody can do it, and almost nobody does. You did. Emma did first, Caleb said, and smiled. She grabbed my hand and said, Dad, she needs help. I'd like to tell you I'd have gotten up on my own, but it was an 8-year-old who moved first. I just didn't ignore her. Below them, Lydia looked up, caught them watching, and waved a big, unself-conscious, two-armed wave. The wave of a woman who was no longer trying to make herself small, no longer practicing, not being a burden, no longer disappearing. And beside her at her feet, coloring at a low table, because Caleb brought her by after school most days, now Emma waved too and held up a fresh drawing for them to see, too far away to make out, but unmistakably, gloriously, a horse. And Caleb Morgan, who had once told a billionaire that engines were safer because they never died on you, stood in a building full of people who might, who could, who were fragile and mortal, and reaching for a hope that might break their hearts a 5th time, and felt for the first time in 6 years entirely and unmistakably alive. The wall was down. He'd taken it down himself, brick by brick, and everything he'd been so afraid would come flooding in had come flooding in, and it turned out most of it wasn't pain at all. It was the rest of his life. The horse drawing ended up framed on the wall of the center's main entrance, and that was Lydia's doing, and there was a story behind it that came to define the whole place. It happened about 6 months in on a gray Tuesday afternoon, when a man was carried through the front doors of the Whitmore Rehabilitation Center in almost exactly the state Lydia had been in that night at the restaurant. His name was Walter Briggs, and he was 63 years old, and he was a retired long-haul trucker who'd had a stroke 14 months back and 3 surgeries since, and a wife who'd left because, in his words, she signed up for a husband, not a project. His daughter had brought him, and his daughter was at the end of her rope, and Walter himself sat slumped in the wheelchair with the exact expression Caleb had learned to recognize instantly, not pain, but the deeper thing underneath it, the flat gray look of a man who had decided he was a burden the world was tired of carrying, and who had come to this place not to get better, but because his daughter had begged him, and he no longer had the will to say no. He won't talk, the daughter said quietly to Caleb at the intake desk, her eyes rimmed red. He used to be, you should have known him before. He used to fill up a whole room, now he just sits. The doctors say his body could recover a lot more than it has, that he's plateaued way below where he should be, and they can't figure out why. And I know why, I know exactly why. It's because he's given up, and I don't know how to make him. I can't reach him anymore. Her voice cracked. I read about this place. That it's different. Please tell me it's different. It's different, Caleb said. Give us a little time with him. He didn't send Walter to the physical therapist first. He didn't send him to intake assessment or the medical team or any of the machines that Alexander Whitmore's money had bought. He sent him to Lydia. She wheeled. No. She walked now, but she'd pulled a chair around, so she was at his level, which was a thing she did on purpose. A thing she'd learned from a man who once knelt on a marble floor. She walked over and sat down beside Walter Briggs, close in his space, in the way that said, I'm not going anywhere. And she didn't say any of the things people say. She didn't say you can do this, or stay positive, or we're going to get you back on your feet. She just looked at him for a while, and then she said, they keep looking at your chart before they look at your face, don't they? And Walter Briggs, who hadn't spoken more than 3 words to anyone in weeks, turned his head and looked at her. 2 years ago, Lydia said, I fell through the door of a restaurant because I couldn't stand up anymore, and 40 people watched me hit the floor, and every single one of them decided I wasn't their problem. And you know what I'd decided right before that? I'd decided the kindest thing I could do for everyone who loved me was to stop needing them, to just get smaller and smaller until I disappeared, because I was so tired of being the thing everybody had to manage. She held his eyes. That's where you are right now. I can see it. You've decided you're a burden, and you've decided the way to love the people around you is to stop reaching for anything, because every time you reach it just costs them more. I know that place, Walter. I lived in that place. So I'm not going to tell you you're wrong to feel it. I'm going to tell you something else. Walter's throat worked. When he spoke, his voice was rusted from disuse. What? He said. What are you going to tell me? That there was one man in that restaurant who got up. Lydia's eyes shone. One man out of 40. He didn't know me. He didn't know I had a rich father. He found that out later, and it didn't change anything. He just got up and he walked across that room and he lifted me off the floor and he told me I hadn't done a single thing wrong by needing help. And that one man is the reason this whole building exists. He runs it now. His name's Caleb, and in about 5 minutes he's going to come over here and sit down where I'm sitting, and he's going to do for you exactly what he did for me, which is refuse to look away. She leaned in. You've spent 14 months surrounded by people who look at your chart. You're about to meet the people who look at you. And I'm telling you, from the chair you're sitting in right now on the worst day of your life, it changes everything. Not all at once, but it starts today. It starts with one person who won't leave. And Walter Briggs, retired trucker, 63 years old, who had not cried since his stroke, because crying felt like one more thing that would make him a burden, put his working hand over his face and wept. And Lydia Whitmore did the only thing that needed doing, which was to stay right there beside him and not look away. Caleb watched the whole thing from across the room, and beside him, Alexander Whitmore watched it too, and neither of them said anything for a long moment. That's your daughter, Caleb said finally. That's your program, Whitmore answered, and his voice was not steady. It's the same thing now. Can't tell where one stops and the other starts. Caleb was quiet a moment. You know what she's doing over there? She's not counseling him. There's no technique. She's just letting him know somebody already walked the exact road he's on and came out the other side. That's the whole medicine. That's it. Everything else we do here, the therapy, the equipment, all of it, none of it works until somebody does that first. Walter Briggs did not recover in a straight line, because nobody does. But he recovered. The daughter who'd brought him in at the end of her rope came to Caleb 3 months later and couldn't get through a sentence, could only grip his hand with both of hers and shake her head and cry because her father had called her that morning, dialed the phone himself, with the hand that 4 surgeries and 14 months hadn't been able to make work, just to tell her he loved her, and that he was sorry for how small he'd let himself get. And Caleb held her hands and let her cry, and told her the thing he told all of them, which was that her father had done the hard part himself, that all they'd done here was remind him he was still in there. That was the pattern of it over the first year and the second. People came through the doors gray and folded and certain they were burdens. And the first thing that happened to them before the assessment, before the machines, before any of it, was that somebody sat down beside them and refused to leave. Lydia trained the peer counselors herself, and the first thing she taught them, the thing she put above every clinical skill, was the thing Caleb had put above every clinical skill: the staying comes first. Everything else is downstream of the staying. The center filled, and then it had a waiting list, and then Alexander Whitmore, who had spent 3 years failing to build one working program, quietly began building a second one across the state, and a third, all of them run on the philosophy of a harbor mechanic and the lived experience of an heiress who'd nearly died on a restaurant floor. The Foundation's board asked Caleb to write it down, the method, the thing that made it work, so it could be taught, so it could scale. Caleb tried for a week, and then gave up and handed them a single page, and at the top of the page it said, "Get up. Cross the room. Don't look away. Stay." The board wanted more. Caleb told them that was more than most people ever managed, and if they could get their staff to actually do those 4 things, the rest would take care of itself. Whitmore, who a year earlier would have insisted on a 200-page operations manual, laughed and told the board to frame the single page. But the story isn't really about the centers or the waiting lists or the second and third locations. Though all of that was real, and all of that mattered to the thousands of people it eventually reached. The story is about a smaller thing. The thing that was actually at the center of all of it, which was what happened to 4 people whose lives collided on a February night in a restaurant nobody would have picked for it. It was about Emma first, who grew up in the halls of that center as much as she grew up anywhere, who did her homework at the low table in the common room while patients recovered around her, who by the time she was 10 had drawn something for nearly every person who'd ever come through the doors, whose horses hung framed on walls throughout the building because it turned out a child's drawing given freely to a frightened stranger was its own kind of medicine, one no degree could teach. She grew up understanding in her bones, in a way most people spend their whole lives failing to learn, that you get up when someone falls, that you cross the room. That the size of a gesture has nothing to do with the size of what it saves. She'd started all of it. She was the one who grabbed her father's hand that night and said, "Dad, she needs help." And Caleb never once let her forget that the whole thing, the rescue, the program, the thousands of lives had begun with an 8-year-old who wasn't willing to look away, and who had in doing so reached back into her own father and woken up the healer he'd buried with her mother. Because that was the other thing that happened. The thing Caleb had been most afraid of and most needed. The wall came down, and it stayed down. He didn't go numb again. He'd feared that letting the world back in would mean drowning in it, that if he let himself care about patients again, he'd lose them, and it would break him the way losing Sarah had broken him. And some of them he did lose. That was the truth of the work. That not everyone gets better, that some people come through the doors too far gone, and you sit with them anyway, and you stay anyway, and then you grieve them, and it hurts every time it hurts. But Caleb learned the thing he'd spent 6 years refusing to learn, which was that the grief was the price of the caring, and the caring was worth the price, that a life spent avoiding loss was not actually a life that Sarah would have been ashamed of the man he'd become. In her name, a man who fixed engines because engines couldn't die on him, and proud, so proud, of the man he became instead. He talked to her sometimes at the harbor, still on the rare weekends he went back to watch the water. He'd tell her about the work. He'd tell her he was sorry it took him 6 years and a stranger falling through a door to remember who he was. He'd tell her that Emma was extraordinary, that Emma had her mother's heart, that Emma had been the one to reach him when nobody else could. And then he'd drive back to the center, back to the living, and he'd get up and cross the room and stay again and again for as long as it took. And it was about Alexander Whitmore, who was the hardest to change and who changed the most. The man who had loved his daughter so much he forgot how to be near her, learned slowly, painfully in his 60s, how to simply sit with someone he loved. It didn't come naturally. It never fully did. He was a man built to solve, to fund, to fix, to do. And learning to just be present was for him the hardest thing he ever attempted, harder than building the empire, harder than any of it. But he tried. He showed up at the center, not as its funder, but as a volunteer, and he sat with patients, and he was terrible at it. At first, reaching always for the practical thing, the solvable thing, and Lydia would catch his eye across the room and shake her head gently. "Just stay, Dad. Don't fix, stay." And slowly over years he learned. He learned to sit at a bedside and hold a hand and say nothing. He learned that presence was not a lesser thing than action, that it was in fact the harder and higher thing. The thing all his money had never been able to buy, because it could not be bought, only given, and only by being there. "I spent 30 years, he told Caleb once, late, the two of them alone in the empty center after hours, thinking love was what you did for people. The things you gave them, the problems you solved, the future you secured. And it took my daughter almost dying, and a mechanic getting up in a restaurant to teach me that love is mostly just being in the room, staying in the room. When there's nothing to fix and nothing to solve and nothing to do but be there." He shook his head. "The most important thing I ever learned, and I learned it at 61 from a man who fixes engines. Fixed, Caleb corrected, smiling. Past tense. Fixed, Whitmore agreed. Now you fix people. Now I stay with people. There's a difference. You taught me that one, actually. You told me a wall keeps the living out as well as the pain. I've stolen that line about 400 times. Steal it. It's the truest thing I ever said, and I only said it because I'd spent my whole life proving it. And it was about Lydia, most of all. Lydia, who had fallen through a restaurant door, certain she was a burden the world was tired of carrying, and who became, over the years that followed the beating heart of a thing that gave thousands of people their lives back. She recovered not completely, because complete recovery was never in the cards, because the medicine could only do so much, and 4 failed surgeries had left permanent marks. She lived with chronic pain. She had limits. There were things she'd never do that the girl before the illness had done without thinking. But she'd learned Caleb's lesson down to the marrow, the lesson about the 2 kinds of hope, and she never again bet her whole life on the big, impossible hope of being fixed. She bet on Tuesdays. She collected small good things, and nobody could take them from her. And it turned out a life built out of small good things was not a smaller life at all, but a fuller one, closer, more present, less spent straining toward a horizon that never came. You know what I figured out, she told Caleb, years in the 2 of them watching a new group of patients arrive on a bright spring morning, gray and folded, and certain the way they always came the way she'd come. That night in the restaurant, I thought I was walking out to disappear. I really did. I'd decided the kindest thing was to get smaller until I was gone. And instead, I fell through a door and landed at the one table with the one man who wouldn't look away, and it turned into this. She gestured at the full humming alive building around them. All of it, everything. And I used to think I got lucky. That out of 40 people I landed in front of the one who'd get up. She turned to him. But that's not it, is it? That's not the real thing. What's the real thing? Caleb asked, though he suspected he knew. The real thing is that any of them could have been the one. All 40 of them. Getting up wasn't some rare gift only you had. Anybody in that room could have crossed the floor. It cost nothing. It required nothing but the willingness to be inconvenienced to look up from your dinner, to decide a stranger's suffering was your business. Her voice was fierce now, the fierceness that had run accountability from a wheelchair in a burning building, the fierceness that had reached Walter Briggs when nobody else could. That's the whole thing, isn't it? That's what this whole place is. It's not a place for rare heroes. It's a place that reminds ordinary people that they can get up, that they were always able to, that the thing standing between a person on the floor and a person who gets rescued isn't some special virtue. It's just one ordinary human being deciding not to look away. She was crying now, but smiling through it. 40 people looked away. 1 got up, and the difference between them wasn't courage or kindness or character. It was just a choice. A tiny, ordinary, world-changing choice available to every single person in that room. And you made it. And it saved my life. And then you spent the rest of your life teaching other people that they can make it too. Caleb was quiet for a while. Below them in the common room, a peer counselor Lydia had trained was pulling a chair around to sit at eye level with a frightened new arrival and an 8-year-old's framed drawing of a blue horse hung on the wall above them. And Alexander Whitmore, 70 now, was sitting at a bedside somewhere in the building holding a stranger's hand and saying nothing, having finally in his old age learned how. My daughter said something that night, Caleb said finally. Before any of it. Before we knew who you were, before the ambulance, before all of this, she'd told a patient no. She told you actually right at the start in the hospital. She gave you her bracelet, and she said, "My dad says people don't need heroes. They need someone who stays." He smiled. I don't even remember telling her that, but she was right. She's always been right, that kid. People don't need heroes. Heroes are rare, and they're far away, and they show up in stories. What people need is somebody who stays. And staying isn't rare at all. Anybody can stay. That's the secret nobody believes until they see it. The most powerful thing in the world, and it's free, and it's available to everyone, and almost nobody does it. You did it, Lydia said. You still do it, every single day. "We do it," Caleb said. "All of us. That's the whole point. It was never supposed to be just me." The final scene, if a life could be said to have one, came years later on an ordinary afternoon that nobody planned to be significant. Emma was 17 now, applying to colleges, and every essay she wrote came back to the same night, the same choice, the same February evening when she was 8 years old, and grabbed her father's hand and said she needs help. She was going to study medicine, not because anyone pushed her, but because she'd grown up understanding better than most doctors ever would, that the medicine that mattered most was the staying, and she wanted to spend her life doing both. Caleb had gray in his hair now, and lines around his eyes that came from a decade of caring, instead of a decade of numbness, and he wore every one of them like they were medals, because they were. Lydia ran the peer counseling program across all 4 centers now, and had testified before Congress about patient dignity, and had a small apartment near the flagship center, and a life built entirely out of Good Tuesdays. And she was by every measure that had ever mattered to her. Whole, not fixed. Never fixed, but whole, which turned out to be the better thing. And Alexander Whitmore was old and slow and softer than the man who'd swept into a hospital corridor in a long dark coat a decade before, and he spent most of his days at bedsides. Now having handed the empire to people who could run it, having finally understood that the only thing he'd ever built that would truly outlast him was the thing he'd learned to do with his hands empty and his mouth closed, just sitting, just staying just there. The 4 of them had dinner together most weeks. Not at the Valentine Harbor restaurant. They'd never once gone back and never talked about why, though everyone knew. They ate at Caleb's kitchen table, usually the same modest house he'd raised Emma in, because it turned out that a billionaire and an heiress and a former mechanic and a young woman about to become a doctor were, when you stripped away everything else, just a family built not by blood or money or fame, but by a single choice made on a single night, to get up to cross a room to refuse to look away. And on this particular ordinary afternoon, a young woman came through the doors of the flagship center, mid-20s, pale, unsteady, gripping the doorframe with the gray look and the shallow breathing, and the eyes full of the specific shame of a person who has decided she's a burden. And before any staff member could reach her, before Caleb, or Lydia, or anyone, a boy did a teenage volunteer 16 years old, who'd grown up hearing the story of this place, the way other kids grew up hearing fairy tales, and who crossed the room without being told, and knelt down in front of the frightened young woman, and said in a voice that carried a decade of accumulated wisdom he was too young to know he had, "Hey, I've got you. You haven't done a single thing wrong by being here. What's your name?" Caleb watched it from across the room, and Lydia watched it beside him. And neither of them said anything for a long moment because there was nothing to say, because there it was, the whole thing, the entire point of every day of the last 10 years playing out in front of them in the form of a 16-year-old boy who had never met them, but who had, without knowing it, inherited the one thing they'd spent a decade trying to give away. "You see that?" Lydia whispered. "I see it. That's it. That's the whole thing. It doesn't stop with us. It never stops. We got up and now they get up, and someday somebody's going to fall in front of that boy and he's going to teach them to get up and—" Her voice broke. "It goes on. It just goes on forever. Because it was never about being rescued, Caleb. It was about learning to be the one who rescues. And you can teach that. It turns out you can actually teach that." Caleb Morgan stood in the middle of the thing he'd built out of the wreckage of his own grief, watching a boy he'd never trained do the one thing that mattered most in the world, watching a frightened stranger begin in real time to believe she was still a person. And he thought about a February night, a decade gone, about a restaurant full of the wealthiest people in the city, about 40 men and women who looked away, and one small girl who didn't. He thought about the wall he'd built to keep out the pain, and how it had kept out the whole world, and how a stranger falling through a door had knocked the first brick loose. He thought about Sarah, and about how the man he'd become would have made her weep with pride, and how the man he'd been before would have made her weep for a different reason entirely. He thought about how close he'd come to staying numb, how close he'd come to saying no to the hospital, no to the program, no to all of it. No to the whole flooding, roaring, aching, magnificent rest of his life. How the difference between the man who fixed engines and the man who fixed lives had been nothing more than a choice made and remade every single day, to get up, to cross the room, to refuse to look away, to stay. And he understood, standing there watching it pass into hands younger than his own, that this was the only thing he'd ever really done, the only thing worth doing, the thing that outlasts money and fame and even grief itself. A young woman fell through a door, and everyone looked away, and one man got up. That was all it had ever been. That was everything it had ever needed to be. And it would never, so long as one ordinary person was willing to cross one ordinary room, ever end.